April 18, 1942. The deck of the USS Hornet heaved in the Pacific swells as 16 twin-engine bombers, far too large for a carrier's deck, waited in silence. The morning wind ripped across the bow, carrying the smell of fuel and salt. Rain spat sideways, blurring the horizon. On the first bomber, Colonel James H. Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft the Army Air Forces had already labeled obsolete. The North American B-25 Mitchell was built for medium-range bombing runs over Europe, not short-deck takeoffs from a heaving ship. Every engineer who'd seen the plan said it was madness. Every pilot who volunteered knew it was a one-way trip. The Navy's task force had been spotted earlier than expected. Japan now knew something was coming. If the bombers didn't take off immediately, they'd be trapped by Japanese patrols before ever reaching land. Doolittle looked down the short stretch of metal ahead of him, just 467 feet, and throttled forward. The engine screamed against the gusts, the Hornet's bow dipped, and for a heartbeat the bomber seemed to hang over the sea. Then by inches the obsolete aircraft lifted free. One by one the others followed, each carrying 4 bombs and the weight of a nation's humiliation after Pearl Harbor. For weeks, engineers had argued the mission was impossible. The B-25's wingspan, fuel load, and torque would never allow a safe launch. Modifications stripped weight to the bone, armor removed, turrets deactivated, extra fuel tanks welded into every cavity. Even the Norden bomb sights were replaced with crude homemade devices crafted from aluminum and gum wrappers. It was a desperate gamble dressed in innovation. As the last plane clawed into the clouds, sailors on deck saluted, knowing none would return to the carrier. Ahead lay 650 nautical miles of open water, enemy radar, and the most defended city on Earth. Tokyo believed itself untouchable, too far for any American bomber to reach. Doolittle's formation, 16 aging, patched-up aircraft, was about to rewrite that belief. The world would soon learn that obsolete could still mean unstoppable. Months earlier, the idea had sounded closer to desperation than strategy. America needed to strike back after Pearl Harbor, not just to damage Japan, but to prove it could reach them at all. The mission, first whispered in a planning room at the Naval War College, was almost laughed out of existence. No bomber in the American arsenal had the range to take off from a carrier, drop bombs on Tokyo, and make it to safety in China. But one man, Captain Francis Lowe, had an audacious thought. What if a medium bomber could be modified to launch from a carrier's deck? The suggestion made its way to Army Air Forces Commander Henry Hap Arnold, who called in a relentless problem solver, James Doolittle. Doolittle studied every aircraft in service. The B-26 Marauder was too fast and unstable at low speed. The 20 Havoc couldn't carry enough fuel. The B-25 Mitchell was heavier than both, but it handled predictably, had twin engines for reliability, and could fly long distances if stripped down. The decision defied logic, but Doolittle had a reputation for betting on the improbable. At Eglin Field, Florida, a group of hand-picked pilots trained in secret. They practiced short takeoffs on runways marked with the exact length of a carrier deck. Every foot mattered. They learned to yank the B-25's nose skyward just at the bow's edge, skimming treacherously low before climbing out. Meanwhile, engineers worked around the clock. They replaced the belly turret with extra fuel tanks, tuned the engines for maximum thrust, and recalibrated fuel mixtures for longer endurance. Bomb racks were reconfigured to hold incendiaries designed to ignite Tokyo's industrial districts. Navigation maps were hand-drawn. There was no precedent for flying this route. Everything had to work perfectly once. Still, critics called it suicide wrapped in symbolism. The Mitchell was a relic compared to Japan's modern interceptors. The mission would have no fighter escort, no return to safety, and no guarantee the pilots could even reach friendly territory. Yet Doolittle's calm certainty held them together. He told his men, "We're doing this to show the enemy they're not safe." It was enough. The obsolete B-25s were no longer just aircraft. They were instruments of psychological warfare, sharpened by ingenuity and sheer willpower. Hours after takeoff, the 16 bombers flew low and fast above a restless sea, engines groaning under the extra fuel load. They had launched nearly 200 miles early after a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force, meaning every gallon now counted. Each man in the formation knew what that meant. They would not have enough fuel to reach the designated recovery airfields in China. Yet no one turned back. At 1,500 feet, the B-25s crossed the Japanese coast. Civilians on beaches looked up in disbelief. No one had ever seen American aircraft in these skies. Air raid sirens began to wail across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Doolittle's lead bomber approached the capital first. Through broken clouds, the Tokyo skyline appeared: factories, rail yards, and the Imperial Arsenal. Bomb bay doors yawned open. 4 500-pounders tumbled free, vanishing into the haze below. Seconds later, orange fireballs rippled through the industrial district. Anti-aircraft batteries erupted from rooftops, tracers clawing at the sky. The B-25s roared through at treetop height, engines screaming against flak bursts that shook their wings. Pilots weaved between smokestacks and radio towers, dropping their payloads with surgical precision born of training and desperation. Japanese fighters scrambled from nearby airfields but couldn't gain altitude in time. The intruders were gone almost as soon as they'd appeared, each turning southwest toward the coast, racing the dying sun and their own dwindling fuel. Onboard, radio men sent brief coded messages confirming strikes. They had done the impossible, bombed Tokyo with land-based bombers launched from a carrier. Damage was limited by later standards, but the psychological shock was immense. The myth of Japan's invulnerability shattered in an instant. As night fell, the cost of that triumph became clear. Low clouds and worsening weather blinded the crews. One by one, fuel gauges dropped to zero. Some pilots bilayed out over the Chinese coastline, others crash-landed in rice paddies or mountains. One crew ended up in Soviet territory and was interned. Several were captured by the Japanese, tortured, or executed. Yet Doolittle, who believed he would be court-martialed for losing every aircraft, was met back home as a hero. What began as a desperate morale mission had become a symbol of resolve, a message written in fire over Tokyo. America could strike back. The physical damage to Japan's war industry from the raid was minor. Fewer than a dozen factories were destroyed and only a few hundred casualties recorded, but the psychological effect was seismic. For the first time, the Japanese public heard air raid sirens not as training drills but as a real threat. Newspapers were forced to admit that enemy bombers had reached the capital. The illusion of an impregnable homeland evaporated overnight. Inside the Imperial Palace, senior commanders were humiliated. How had the Americans, supposedly still reeling from Pearl Harbor, managed to reach Tokyo itself? The reaction was swift and furious. Japanese leadership diverted fighter units and anti-aircraft guns from the front lines to defend the home islands. Carrier task forces were recalled for homeland protection. Strategic resources that might have bolstered the war effort in the Pacific were suddenly tied down by paranoia. It was exactly what Doolittle and his superiors had hoped for, a disruption far greater than the tonnage of bombs dropped. Tokyo's anger led to rash decisions. In the weeks that followed, Japan accelerated plans to lure America's remaining carriers into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll. That reaction would prove catastrophic. For the United States, the raid was worth every risk. Newspapers splashed photos of Doolittle's crew across front pages. America finally had a story of triumph after months of losses in the Pacific. Tokyo bombed, blared the headlines. To the public, it didn't matter that all 16 bombers had been lost. What mattered was that courage and ingenuity had defied logic. The supposed relic B-25 had become the symbol of defiance itself. In laboratories and hangars, the raid's lessons began shaping the future of air warfare. Engineers analyzed the Mitchell's modifications, noting how minor design changes had extended range and versatility far beyond its intended limits. Strategists realized that small, adaptable bomber formations could project power faster and deeper than massive armadas. The Doolittle Raid, born of desperation, had quietly rewritten the manual for strategic reach. And all of it had been achieved by an aircraft the experts had dismissed as too slow, too old, and too ordinary to make history. In the months after the raid, the B-25's reputation transformed overnight. What had once been a stopgap bomber suddenly became the centerpiece of Allied medium bombing strategy. Production lines ramped up across North America, Inglewood, Kansas City, and Willow Run, pumping out new variants that fixed weaknesses revealed in Tokyo's skies. Engineers refined engines, strengthened wings, and added forward-firing machine guns, turning the Mitchell into a low-level strike weapon feared from Burma to Sicily. The obsolete label vanished as combat crews discovered just how adaptable the design truly was. In the Pacific, B-25s evolved into gunships. Under the command of General George Kenney, modified versions like the B-25G and H carried a 75mm cannon in the nose, an artillery piece capable of shredding Japanese shipping and ground installations. Pilots learned to skim treetops at 200 miles per hour, unleashing torrents of fire across enemy convoys and airfields. These missions, blending precision and brutality, made the Mitchell one of the most versatile aircraft of the war. In North Africa and Italy, other squadrons used it for interdiction strikes, blowing up bridges, rail lines, and fuel depots before retreating Axis forces could regroup. Crews came to trust the B-25 as much for its ruggedness as its firepower. It could lose an engine and still make it home, take rounds through the fuselage and keep flying straight. Mechanics praised its simplicity, pilots called it forgiving. The same qualities that had made it seem unglamorous, the thick wings, heavy frame, and conservative design, were exactly what kept crews alive. It was, as one pilot joked, the bomber built for second chances. By 1944, more than 10,000 Mitchells had rolled off assembly lines, flying in every major theater of the war. The aircraft's distinctive rumble became the sound of American persistence. Every time it thundered low over jungle or desert, the legend of Doolittle's Raid echoed. The same machine that had once tiptoed off the deck of a carrier in defiance of physics was now rewriting tactics across continents. The B-25 had not just survived obsolescence, it had turned it into a weapon. When the war ended in 1945, the B-25 Mitchell stood as proof that innovation doesn't always begin with new technology, it often starts with daring imagination. Thousands of airmen returned home with stories of the aircraft that had carried them farther, faster, and through more punishment than anyone thought possible. The obsolete machine had outlived new arrivals, serving with the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and dozens of allied nations well into the 1950s. In China, Indonesia, and Brazil, B-25s became symbols of independence and modernization, bridging the gap between piston power and the jet age. Even stripped-down civilian versions found work surveying jungles, fighting forest fires, and hauling freight, proof that practicality never goes out of style. Historians often describe the Doolittle Raid as an act of morale rather than strategy, but its influence ran deeper. It forced Japan to overextend, led to the pivotal clash at Midway, and revealed that psychological warfare could equal physical destruction. Yet behind those sweeping consequences was the simple truth of engineering: reliability wins wars. The B-25 was not elegant nor revolutionary in design. It was simply robust, designed with enough redundancy and margin for error that it could absorb the unpredictable chaos of real combat. That philosophy would echo in every successful aircraft that followed. The Mitchell's story became a quiet lesson for future generations of designers. Perfection is not the goal, effectiveness is. Every rivet, every redundant system, every ounce of overbuilt structure had purpose. It was a machine designed not for admiration, but for endurance. Like the men who flew it, it embodied resilience. Today, when restored B-25s thunder across airshows, spectators see more than a relic, they see a message carved in aluminum. Innovation is not about chasing beauty or novelty, but about meeting the impossible with determination. From that day on the Hornet's deck to the jungles of Burma and the skies over Tokyo, the B-25 proved that even what the world calls obsolete can still shape history. It didn't just blow a hole in Tokyo's defenses, it blew open the limits of what courage, creativity, and a flawed old bomber could achieve.